There are places in the world where time seems to slow, where the air holds a certain weight of history, and where silence speaks louder than words. The valley where my grandfather built his cabin was one of those rare places. Tucked far away from highways, cell towers, and the endless hum of modern life, it had always existed like a hidden pocket of nature, sealed off from the outside world. I remembered it vividly from my childhood. The sharp scent of pine drifting through the air, the way the creek sparkled under the midday sun, and the cabin itself, a sturdy log structure built with his own hands. That valley was my sanctuary as a child. Summers were spent running barefoot through meadows, my days filled with simple adventures that would later become cherished memories. I remembered my grandfather telling stories on the porch, his deep voice carrying over the crackle of the fire pit. I remembered catching dragonflies by the stream, their wings flashing like stained glass against the light. And I remembered how fiercely he spoke of the valley's privacy, how he always said that land was ours and ours alone, untouched by outside rules. But life has a way of pulling people away from the places they love. After my grandfather passed, I grew older, and the demands of school, work, and adulthood consumed me. The cabin stood quietly through the years, visited only by rain and snow, its logs darkening with weather and time. Nearly 15 years passed without my return. The valley slipped into memory, the kind you think about on sleepless nights, wondering if it's still the same or if the world has taken it away. And then, one day, I decided to go back. The drive into the valley felt surreal, almost like entering a dream I hadn't had in years. The road that led there twisted through dense forest, growing narrower and rougher the deeper I went. My phone signal dropped, and the outside world simply vanished, replaced by the sound of tires crunching gravel and the whisper of wind through trees. Each bend of the road stirred old memories, and I felt both excitement and unease, as though the valley might not welcome me after so long. Finally, the familiar sight came into view. The clearing, the cabin, the sloping meadow leading down to the creek. For a moment, I felt a wave of relief. It was still there. The cabin looked weathered but proud, its logs darkened by time, its stone chimney still standing firm. The porch sagged slightly, the roof showed patches of moss, but it was mine, waiting patiently all these years. But then, I noticed something different, something strange. At the entrance to the valley, where once there had been nothing but an old wooden post, there now stood a fresh sign. Painted in bold white letters across polished wood, it read, Valley Ridge Estates, an HOA community. I froze. The words didn't make sense. An HOA, estates? My grandfather's valley had always been private land. No homeowners association had ever existed here. How could there possibly be an HOA in the middle of land that I legally owned, land passed down to me through family? The idea gnawed at me, unsettling and absurd. The further I drove, the stranger it became. There were new houses where there had once been forest. Modern two-story builds, complete with manicured lawns, trimmed hedges, and driveways lined with SUVs. Bright mailboxes stood in neat rows by the road, freshly painted and identical, as though chosen from the same catalog. Families lived here now. Children's bicycles leaned against fences, and laughter carried faintly through the trees. It wasn't the valley I remembered. I parked in front of the cabin, stepping out onto the cracked dirt driveway. The air smelled the same, pine, earth, the faint tang of water from the creek. But the atmosphere was different. Watching eyes lingered on me from across the road. Curtains shifted. A couple walking their dog slowed, whispering as they passed. And then I saw her. From across the road, a woman appeared. She was dressed sharply, her posture rigid, and her stride purposeful. She looked to be in her late 40s, though the way she carried herself gave her an aura of authority that reached far beyond her age. Her chin was slightly lifted, her expression cool and assessing, and in her hand, she carried a clipboard that seemed glued to her arm. She didn't wave. She didn't smile. She simply stood at the edge of her driveway, staring at me with narrowed eyes, as though my arrival were an offense. I didn't know her name yet. I didn't know her reputation. But I knew her type. She carried herself with the unmistakable air of control, the kind of person who believed rules existed to keep everyone in line, her line. Later, I would come to learn what everyone in Valley Ridge Estates already knew her name was Karen, and she wasn't just a resident here. She was the self-appointed queen of the HOA. At that moment, however, she was simply a stranger, one whose disapproving glare made it clear that my return was not welcome. Inside the cabin, dust hung heavy in the air, stirred up by the opening of the door. The wood smelled old. The floor creaked under my weight, and sunlight filtered through cracks in the shutters. It felt untouched, as though the cabin had been holding its breath in my absence. I walked slowly, running my hand over the rough wood of the banister, remembering how small I once felt climbing those stairs. But as I settled in, that unease crept back. Something was off. The houses outside, the HOA sign, the woman with the clipboard. It all clashed with the valley I remembered. And though I wanted to believe I could quietly slip back into my old sanctuary, I knew that wasn't going to happen. Because if that woman outside truly believed I was under her control, if she thought my cabin, the one my grandfather had built long before her neighborhood ever existed, belonged to her HOA, then there would be conflict. I could feel it already. And as I unpacked, as I set down boxes of old photographs and maps my grandfather had left behind, I realized something. Karen didn't know the truth. She didn't know that my family hadn't just owned the cabin, but the land, the creek, the ridges, the meadows, the entire valley. It wasn't just a home. It was an inheritance, a responsibility, a claim written in deeds and surveys that had stood for decades. Every inch of Valley Ridge Estates had been carved into my land, leased but never sold, built upon with temporary agreements that didn't change ownership. Karen thought she ran the valley, but in reality, she was standing on ground that belonged to me. And when she found out, she wouldn't take it lightly. The silence of the cabin that night felt heavy, like the calm before a storm. Outside, porch lights flickered on across the road, illuminating manicured lawns and driveways. Shadows moved in the windows of new houses, families eating dinner, children laughing. And across the way, I could still see her, standing at her window, staring directly at the cabin, watching me like a hawk. The valley wasn't the same as I had left it. It had been reshaped, altered, claimed by people who didn't understand its history. But the truth remained beneath their fences and trimmed hedges. This was my valley. And whether Karen liked it or not, I had returned to reclaim it. The storm was coming. I could feel it building, even in the stillness of that first night, and Karen was about to find out that the valley she thought she ruled had never been hers at all. Morning sunlight streamed through the cabin's old windows, cutting across the dust motes that swirled lazily in the air. I woke to the familiar smell of aged wood and pine sap, and for a fleeting moment, it felt like childhood again. But then, the distant hum of car engines and the faint sound of a lawnmower broke the illusion. The valley was no longer the isolated refuge I remembered. It had neighbors now, neighbors bound together under a banner of authority I hadn't asked for, the HOA. By the time I stepped onto the porch with a mug of coffee, she was there. Karen, the woman I had seen the night before, the one who carried herself like the valley's ruler. She was standing at the edge of my driveway, clipboard in hand, dressed as if she were heading to a boardroom rather than strolling through a rural community. Her arms crossed tightly, her lips pursed, and her eyes raked over the cabin with visible disdain. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her body language screamed judgment. She scribbled something on her clipboard, then glanced pointedly at the cabin's mossy roof, the cracked paint on the shutters, the sagging porch rail. Every imperfection seemed to fuel her pen. When she caught sight of my old pickup truck, parked by the cabin, her brows furrowed, and she scribbled again, faster this time, as though each note was ammunition. Behind her, two neighbors lingered, a middle-aged man in jogging clothes, and a woman pushing a stroller slowed their pace, pretending to chat, but clearly watching the interaction unfold. From the houses across the road, curtains shifted. Curious eyes peered out, hungry for gossip. Karen's presence wasn't casual. This was a performance. Every scribble on her clipboard was designed to send a message. I was being evaluated, judged. And in her eyes, I was failing. What she didn't realize was that her judgment held no power over me. At least, not legally. But Karen thrived on appearances, and appearances were everything in Valley Ridge Estates. She wasn't just another neighbor. She was the queen bee of the HOA, and every resident orbited around her authority, whether out of loyalty or fear. Over the next few days, her campaign against me became more obvious. Each morning, I would spot her circling near the property, as though conducting inspections. One day, she paused at the old fence line where weather-worn boards leaned unevenly, shaking her head before jotting notes. Another day, she gestured toward the weeds creeping up the driveway, her disapproval written plainly on her face. She was building a case, layering small grievances into something larger. And the neighbors followed her lead. The man with the jogging outfit avoided eye contact now, quickening his pace whenever I waved. The woman with the stroller began steering her path wider around the cabin. Conversations would hush when I walked by, whispers trailing behind me. I was being painted as an outsider in the very valley my family had owned for generations. It would have been easy to argue, to confront her, to tell her outright that her rules didn't apply here. But something inside me told me to wait, to gather my strength, just as my grandfather had taught me when I was young. Patience, he used to say, isn't weakness. It's a weapon. So, I bided my time. In the evenings, I dug through the boxes I had brought from my grandfather's study. Maps, surveyor reports, yellowed deeds with signatures faded by time. Each paper was a reminder of the truth this valley wasn't some subdivision carved into parcels for an HOA to control. It was private property, wholly owned by my grandfather, passed directly to me. The more I read, the clearer it became. Every house in Valley Ridge Estates stood on land leased under limited agreements, contracts that granted building rights, but never transferred ownership. My grandfather had been shrewd, ensuring that no matter what was built, the valley would remain in his family's name. Karen's HOA was built on a fragile illusion, an organization that operated under the assumption of ownership, but without the foundation to enforce it. But Karen didn't know this. Or worse, maybe she did and simply counted on intimidation to keep others from questioning her authority. She thrived on order, on appearances, on being the loudest voice in the room. And she was already escalating. 3 days after my arrival, I found a folded paper tucked into the cabin's screen door. It was crisp, printed with official-looking formatting and bold lettering across the top. Notice of violation beneath it, a list of infractions, covered the page. Failure to maintain landscaping. Unsightly exterior conditions. Unauthorized vehicle parked in view. Each one followed by vague threats of fines and further action if the homeowner did not comply. At the bottom was a signature, written with exaggerated flourish, Karen L., HOA President. The paper might have carried weight with the other residents, but to me it was nothing more than ink and arrogance. Still, I tucked it away carefully. Evidence. Proof of her overreach. The next morning, as if on cue, Karen was back at the edge of the driveway, clipboard in hand, her gaze expectant, waiting for me to react. Perhaps she thought I would come running, panicked, ready to negotiate. Perhaps she thought the threat of fines would bend me into submission. Instead, I simply sipped my coffee and stared back, unflinching. Her jaw tightened. Her pen scratched harder against the paper. Behind her, the jogger slowed again, curious to witness the silent standoff. The balance of power in Valley Ridge Estates had never been challenged before, and Karen was not accustomed to resistance. But resistance was only the beginning. I knew that if she was willing to invent authority over my cabin, she would escalate further. Petty citations would lead to louder complaints. Gossip would harden into hostility. And eventually, she would try to make my life unbearable. But Karen didn't know the truth. Not yet. She didn't know that her entire kingdom rested on land she didn't own, land she couldn't control. She didn't know that the valley, every acre of it, was mine. I decided then that I wouldn't reveal it too early. Timing mattered. Let her build her case. Let her gather her neighbors, embolden them with false authority. The higher she climbed on her throne, the harder the fall would be. Because the moment the truth came out, the illusion would shatter. And Karen, the self-appointed queen of Valley Ridge Estates, would be exposed for what she really was, a ruler without a crown, clinging desperately to power she never had. That night, as the sun dipped below the ridges and shadows crept across the meadow, I sat on the porch of the cabin, the violation notice in my hand. Across the way, porch lights flickered on, neighbors gathering in driveways, chatting, laughing. And at the center of it all was Karen, clipboard clutched tightly, her voice carrying as she addressed them, pointing toward the cabin with sweeping gestures. She wasn't just writing reports anymore. She was rallying her troops. The battle lines were being drawn, and soon the valley would learn the truth. The first week back in the valley set the tone for what was to come. Karen's watchful eyes seemed to follow me everywhere. Every time I stepped outside, whether it was to gather firewood or to sweep the cabin porch, she was there. Across the road, at the end of her driveway, or walking briskly down the street with that ever-present clipboard in hand. It was as though she had appointed herself guardian of the neighborhood, and I was her latest project, an intruder who needed to be whipped into shape. Her tactics grew bolder. More notices appeared tucked into my door, each one listing a growing tally of infractions. The roof was unsightly. The fence was non-compliant. Even the placement of my trash bins earned a written reprimand. Every notice bore her signature, underlined with such authority that it almost seemed carved into the page. Neighbors began to react too. At first, it was subtle. Averted gazes, hesitant smiles that vanished when Karen appeared. Then came the whispers. I would catch them lingering as I passed. He doesn't fit in. That cabin doesn't belong here. Karen says he refuses to follow the rules. Her influence was spreading, shaping opinions before I even had the chance to speak for myself. It was a calculated campaign, and I knew it. Karen understood the power of perception. She wanted me painted as the problem, the rule breaker, the outsider who threatened the order she worked so hard to impose. And in a community where she controlled the narrative, perception carried weight. Still, I remained silent. I let her gather her momentum, knowing that the truth in my possession was stronger than any violation notice she could write. But patience did not make the days easier. The weight of her campaign pressed on me constantly, and the stares from neighbors reminded me that I was alone in this battle. By the second week, the hostility had grown unmistakable. One morning, as I carried groceries from my truck into the cabin, I noticed a group of residents gathered across the road in Karen's driveway. They stood in a semicircle, nodding as Karen spoke animatedly, waving her clipboard in wide arcs, occasionally pointing toward my property. Her voice carried just enough on the breeze for me to catch fragments. Words like non-compliance, hiasor, and property values. It was a meeting, informal yet intentional, and I was its subject. Later that evening, I found a new paper pinned to the cabin door. This one was different, longer, more official looking, filled with citations of community bylaws and warnings of fines escalating into legal action. At the bottom, bolded for emphasis, it read failure to comply will result in HOA enforcement measures. The audacity made me laugh at first. Enforcement. On land that wasn't theirs. On a cabin that predated their entire neighborhood. But the laughter faded quickly. Karen wasn't just bluffing. She was building pressure. She thrived on intimidation, and she knew that most people would fold long before reaching the breaking point. What she didn't know was that I wasn't most people. That night, I spread my grandfather's papers across the cabin's dining table. Deeds, maps, and contracts stretched out before me like a mosaic of truth. Every acre of the valley was accounted for, each boundary line traced in black ink, each signature etched into permanence. My grandfather had never sold a single piece of the valley. Instead, he had allowed limited leasing agreements, short-term rights for developers to build houses, agreements that expired or renewed at his discretion. The HOA had no legal ground. None. But Karen was betting on ignorance. She was betting that I wouldn't fight back, that I wouldn't have the courage or the documents to challenge her authority. She was wrong. Still, I needed to be strategic. Revealing the truth too early might dull its impact. No, I would wait until the moment when Karen's confidence peaked, when she believed she had the upper hand, when the neighbors were fully behind her. Only then would the truth land with the force it deserved. In the meantime, her tactics escalated further. The next morning, I stepped outside to find a bright orange sign staked into the ground near the cabin's driveway. In bold letters, it declared "Pro partois inviolate ion, subjecttoaaction." It was meant to humiliate, to publicly brand me as non-compliant. Neighbors walking by slowed to look, shaking their heads, muttering to each other. The cabin, once my sanctuary, was being cast as the community's disgrace. I didn't remove the sign. Not immediately. Instead, I left it standing, a silent reminder of her overreach, a symbol of the absurdity to anyone willing to look closer. Because I knew that soon, the sign would come to represent her failure, not mine. But as the days passed, I could feel the tension tightening like a noose. Karen wasn't satisfied with notices and signs anymore. She began knocking on doors, gathering signatures for something she called a formal complaint. Rumor spread that she intended to bring the issue before the county, to force compliance through outside enforcement. She was determined to prove her dominance, no matter the cost. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the sky turned amber over the ridgeline. I heard the hum of voices carrying across the valley. Another gathering at Karen's house. This time, there were more neighbors. Their cars lined along the street, their silhouettes clustered in her yard. It wasn't just gossip anymore, it was organization. Karen was rallying them, preparing for something bigger. And then, the next day, the announcement arrived. A printed notice, slid into every mailbox along the road, declaring an official HOA meeting to be held the following week. The topic: Community Compliance and Property Standards. I didn't need to read between the lines to know what it meant. The meeting was about me, about the cabin, about my refusal to bend. Karen was ready to escalate the conflict to its highest point, and so was I. That evening, I gathered the documents once more, organizing them carefully into a binder. Each page was a weapon, each signature a shield. My grandfather's foresight had given me everything I needed, and now it was only a matter of time before I used it. The valley outside was quiet, but the silence felt charged, heavy with anticipation. The neighbors carried on with their routines, mowing lawns, walking dogs, watering gardens. But beneath the surface, everyone knew the storm was building. Karen had cast herself as the enforcer, the protector of order, the queen bee defending her hive. She had rallied her subjects, built her case, and convinced herself of her power. But what she didn't realize was that she was walking directly into her undoing. Because at that meeting, when she stood tall and confident before her neighbors, when she unveiled her accusations with dramatic flair, I would be there too. And I would unveil the truth that would shatter her illusion of power forever. The stage was set. The battle for the valley had begun. The day of the HOA meeting arrived with a tension that could be felt in the air like the charge before a thunderstorm. For a week, Karen's notice had sat in every mailbox, and her campaign of whispers had only grown louder. Neighbors gathered in her yard every evening, their cars parked in neat rows along the roadside, their voices carrying through the valley as she spun her narrative. By the time the meeting was announced, she had successfully painted me as the villain, the one dragging down community standards, the one threatening property values, the one who simply didn't belong. Her plan was simple. She wanted to corner me in front of the neighborhood, overwhelm me with her authority, and pressure me into submission. Karen thrived on public displays of control, and this was her stage. But what she didn't realize was that the performance she had orchestrated would be her downfall. When the evening came, I walked down the road to Karen's house. The neighborhood seemed to buzz with anticipation. Cars lined both sides of the street. Porch lights glowed from every house, and the soft hum of voices grew louder the closer I came. From the outside, Karen's house was immaculate, its lawn trimmed to perfection, its hedges sculpted into rigid shapes. Every detail screamed control. Her driveway was packed with folding chairs arranged in rows, a makeshift boardroom, set up under the fading evening light. At the front, a table stood with pitchers of water, stacks of papers, and of course, Karen herself. She stood tall, her clipboard clasped tightly in one hand, her expression cool and confident as neighbors took their seats. I could feel eyes on me as I approached. Conversations hushed, heads turned. To them, I was the subject of the meeting, the man who dared to challenge the order Karen had worked so hard to maintain. I took a seat near the back, setting a plain black binder across my lap. The weight of the documents inside grounded me. They were the truth, and soon, everyone would see it. Karen began with the confidence of a seasoned performer. She tapped her clipboard lightly, signaling for silence, And when the murmurs died down, she launched into her speech. Her words were sharp, polished, and designed to inflame. She spoke of non-compliance. She spoke of community values. She painted the cabin as an eyesore, a relic dragging down the beauty of Valley Ridge estates. She rattled off violations: landscaping, exterior upkeep, vehicle placement, each one punctuated with disapproving glances in my direction. The neighbors nodded along, some with genuine agreement, others with hesitant compliance, afraid to go against the queen bee. Her performance built to a crescendo. She declared that the HOA could no longer tolerate my disregard for their rules, that fines would be imposed, and if necessary, legal action would be pursued to ensure compliance. Her voice carried with authority, her tone leaving no room for doubt. But that was when I rose from my chair. The shift in the atmosphere was immediate. Heads turned, whispers rippled through the crowd, and even Karen faltered for a moment, surprised that I would dare interrupt her stage. I carried the binder to the front, placing it firmly on the table beside her neatly stacked papers. The room, or rather, the driveway, fell silent. All eyes were on me now. Calmly, I opened the binder and pulled out the first document. A deed, yellowed with age, but clear in its details. I held it up for the neighbors to see. "This," I said evenly, "is the original deed to the valley, purchased by my grandfather decades before Valley Ridge Estates ever existed. It covers every acre of land you see here, from the creek to the ridgeline, including the ground beneath every one of your homes." A murmur spread through the crowd, a ripple of confusion and disbelief. Karen stiffened, her expression faltering before quickly hardening again. I laid out the next document. A survey map, carefully drawn, showing the entire valley outlined in black ink. My family's name marked clearly as owner. Then came the leasing agreements, signed by developers who had built the very houses these neighbors lived in. Agreements that gave them rights to live there, but not ownership of the land itself. One by one, I laid them out, each paper striking like a hammer against Karen's illusion of power. Finally, I looked up, sweeping my gaze across the neighbors. "This cabin isn't part of the HOA," I said. "It predates it. My family built it long before your homes were constructed. And the truth is, the HOA doesn't own this valley. It never has. The entire valley, every road, every lot, every acre, belongs to me." The silence that followed was deafening. Faces shifted from confusion to shock, from disbelief to dawning realization. The man in jogging clothes furrowed his brow, whispering something to his wife. The woman with the stroller clutched the handle tighter, her expression unsettled. The illusion they had all lived under was crumbling before their eyes. Karen, however, refused to yield. Her face flushed red, her voice rising sharply as she tried to cut through the silence. "This is nonsense," she snapped, her tone laced with desperation. "The HOA has governed this community since its inception. We set the rules. We enforce them. These papers mean nothing." But her words lacked their usual confidence. The neighbors could see it. The evidence lay spread across the table, undeniable in its clarity. I didn't argue with her. I didn't need to. I simply pointed to the signatures on the contracts, the dates on the deeds, the surveys marking out every boundary. The truth spoke for itself. Whispers grew into conversations. Neighbors leaned toward one another, questioning, debating, realizing that the foundation of Karen's authority was nothing more than assumption and intimidation. For years, she had ruled them with fear of fines and citations, but now they understood that her power was a mirage. Karen tried again, her voice trembling with forced authority. "Regardless of technicalities, this is a community. We need rules, order, structure. Without the HOA, everything falls apart. But her words rang hollow. The neighbors weren't nodding this time. They were staring at her, questioning her, seeing through the cracks in her facade. For the first time, Karen looked small. I gathered the documents back into the binder, closing it with a decisive snap. Then I looked directly at her. The valley isn't yours to control. It never was. You've been enforcing rules you had no right to enforce. And now, everyone knows it. Her face twisted, caught between rage and fear, but she couldn't refute the truth. Not with the evidence laid bare before the very people she had ruled. The meeting dissolved soon after, not with the resolution Karen had planned, but with neighbors leaving in hushed groups, their trust in her shattered. The chairs were folded, the whispers grew louder, and Karen stood alone at her immaculate table, her clipboard hanging limply in her hand. That night, the valley felt different. For the first time since my return, I sensed a shift. The neighbors no longer looked at me with suspicion, but with curiosity, with the tentative realization that the story they had been told was not the truth. Karen, however, would not go quietly. Her power had been challenged, her authority stripped bare, and people like her did not surrender without a fight. And though I had revealed the truth, I knew this was not the end. It was only the beginning. The morning after the HOA meeting, the valley was buzzing with whispers. For years, Karen's word had been law. Now her authority had cracked wide open in front of everyone, and no one could deny what they had seen. But power is rarely surrendered gracefully. For Karen, the unraveling of her control wasn't the end. It was the beginning of her most desperate campaign yet. At first, her strategy was subtle. She tried to reassert normalcy, as though the meeting hadn't ended in disaster. By sunrise, her clipboard was back in hand, and she was out on the sidewalks, approaching neighbors with the same polished smile she had always worn. But the tone was different now. There was an edge to her words, a sharpness behind the pleasantries. Instead of casual conversations about community improvements, she leaned into fear. She whispered about chaos, about what would happen without her leadership, about how quickly the valley could spiral into disorder if rules weren't enforced. For some, her words found a foothold. Fear is persuasive, especially when it has been nurtured for years. A handful of neighbors nodded along, uncertain and uneasy about what came next. But most were hesitant now. They had seen the documents, the deeds, the maps. They knew her authority wasn't real. Still, Karen was relentless, and when soft persuasion failed, she escalated. Within days, anonymous letters appeared in mailboxes. Typed neatly, unsigned, they warned of declining property values and outside threats. They painted me as a careless landowner, someone who would abandon the valley to decay. One letter even suggested that without the HOA, squatters and criminals would soon overrun the place. The language was sharp, calculated to stir panic, and though the neighbors never saw Karen's name on the letters, the rhythm of the words was unmistakably hers. But that was only the beginning. Soon, Karen's tactics grew bolder. She organized a group of her most loyal supporters, the same neighbors who had clung to her authority longest. And together, they began staging little scenes of disorder. A trash bag, accidentally, left split open on the road. A broken lawn chair abandoned near the creek. A rusted bicycle left leaning against a fence. All minor things, but enough to create an illusion of decline. Then Karen swooped in, pointing to the evidence as proof that without the HOA, the valley was already falling apart. It was theater. Manufactured chaos, but to the casual observer, it was convincing. And as her fear campaign spread, I realized Karen wasn't just trying to win back authority. She was trying to turn the entire valley against me, to push me out entirely. I refused to rise to the bait. I cleaned up the messes quietly, mended the damage, and let the neighbors see who was truly maintaining the valley. But Karen wasn't finished. When fear and manipulation failed to regain her grip, she turned to confrontation. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the sky burned orange behind the ridgeline, I found her standing at the edge of my property. Her clipboard was gone, replaced with a thick folder of papers. She held it like a weapon, her lips pressed into a tight line. She accused me of falsifying documents, of tricking the community, of orchestrating some elaborate fraud to undermine her leadership. She claimed she had been in contact with county officials, that she was filing complaints, that I would be exposed as the true liar. Her voice carried down the road, sharp and shrill, echoing against the valley walls. Neighbors peeked from their porches, drawn to the spectacle. Karen wasn't just confronting me. She was performing again, trying to claw back her stage. I didn't engage. Instead, I stood silently, letting her words spill out into the night air until they began to sound more desperate than authoritative. The neighbors watched, their expressions shifting from sympathy to discomfort. They could see the cracks now, the desperation seeping through every accusation. Eventually, her tirade ended not with applause, but with silence. She stormed away, folder clutched tight, her heels striking the pavement like hammers. But Karen wasn't finished. The next week brought the most extreme attempt yet. She gathered her loyalists for what she called an emergency meeting. This time, it wasn't in her driveway, but in the community park, under the pavilion where children usually played and families picnicked. She decorated the space with banners reading, "Protect Valley Standards," and handed out freshly printed flyers warning of landowner abuse. Her message was clear. I wasn't just a nuisance. I was a danger to the community. She urged them to sign a petition, not only to reinstate her HOA power, but to demand legal action against me, to push me out of the valley altogether. But something unexpected happened. As she spoke, neighbors began to push back. One by one, questions rose from the crowd. "Where's your proof?" someone asked. "Didn't we see the deeds with our own eyes?" Another challenged. Even those who had once feared her influence were emboldened now. They had seen the truth laid bare, and no amount of dramatic posturing could undo it. The more Karen doubled down, the more the crowd resisted. By the end, only a handful of her most loyal followers signed her petition. The rest walked away, shaking their heads, leaving her shouting into the emptying park. It was a turning point. For years, Karen had thrived on fear and control, but now her empire was crumbling, and like a cornered animal, she grew more dangerous as her power slipped away. The final straw came late one night. A storm rolled into the valley, wind howling through the trees, rain lashing against rooftops. In the chaos of the storm, a neighbor's fence collapsed, toppling into the road. The next morning, Karen was already there, clipboard once more in hand, pointing at the wreckage as proof of lawlessness. She accused me of negligence, of failing to maintain the valley. She shouted loud enough for everyone to hear, but this time, the neighbors didn't nod or whisper in agreement. They turned away. They had seen through her games. That night, as I sat on the porch of the cabin, the rain still dripping from the eaves, I realized the battle was almost over. Karen had played every card she had: fear, intimidation, lies, even sabotage, and none of it had restored her power. The neighbors were done being controlled. But I also knew Karen well enough to understand she wouldn't go quietly. She had built her identity around ruling this valley, and losing that control wasn't just a defeat. It was an unraveling. And so, even as the storm passed and the valley quieted, I prepared myself for one final confrontation. Because Karen wasn't finished yet. The collapse of her empire was at hand, and I would be there to witness it. The valley had been unsettled for weeks. The air seemed to carry a lingering tension, like the heavy silence after thunder. Ever since the HOA meeting unraveled her authority, Karen had fought tooth and nail to claw back control. She had written letters, staged chaos, organized rallies, and screamed accusations into the night. But despite her efforts, her grip was slipping through her fingers like sand. The neighbors saw it. Each passing day revealed more cracks in her polished facade. Where once her clipboard and confident voice had commanded obedience, now they provoked eye rolls, quiet chuckles, and finally, open defiance. The queen bee of Valley Ridge Estates was becoming an outcast in the very hive she once ruled. Still, Karen was not one to accept defeat gracefully. She had built her life around control, her identity rooted in authority, and surrender was unthinkable. And so, she planned one final, desperate attempt to reclaim her throne. It began with rumors, whispers that she had gone to the county courthouse, claims that she was filing a lawsuit to expose me as a fraud. Some neighbors repeated the whispers nervously, others dismissed them outright. But Karen encouraged the uncertainty, feeding the gossip like kindling to a fire. The climax came one Saturday afternoon when a letter appeared in every mailbox, printed in bold block letters and signed with Karen's unmistakable flourish. It announced a special community assembly to be held in the park, where Karen promised to reveal the truth, once and for all. The valley buzzed with anticipation. People were tired of the conflict, desperate for closure, curious to see what spectacle Karen would stage this time. And so, when the day arrived, nearly every household sent someone to watch. I knew better than to underestimate her. Though her credibility had collapsed, desperation often makes people reckless, and recklessness can be dangerous. So I prepared carefully. My binder of deeds, surveys, and contracts was ready. I walked to the park quietly, arriving early enough to see Karen's stage already set. She had gone all out. The pavilion was decorated with banners proclaiming, "Restore order," and "Protect our homes." Folding chairs were neatly arranged, a microphone and speaker system set up, and at the front, a podium draped with a cloth that bore the HOA's faded logo. Karen stood behind it, dressed immaculately, her expression carved into the same mask of authority she had worn for years, but her eyes betrayed her. There was a wildness there now, an edge that hadn't been present before. The neighbors filed in, murmuring among themselves, some skeptical, others curious. When the crowd had gathered, Karen began. Her voice boomed through the speakers, sharp and commanding. She spoke of betrayal, of lies, of an outsider who had come to disrupt the valley's peace. She waved a thick stack of papers. Documents she claimed were proof of her authority, evidence that the HOA, not I, was the rightful governing power of Valley Ridge Estates. She raised her voice higher with each sentence, hammering her words into the air like nails. "This land," she declared, "does not belong to a single man hiding in a cabin. It belongs to this community, and I am its rightful guardian." The crowd shifted uneasily. Some exchanged doubtful glances. Others folded their arms, unimpressed. A few of her loyalists clapped, their applause thin and forced. I waited until she finished her tirade, until the silence stretched uncomfortably. Then I stepped forward, the binder tucked under my arm. The tension was palpable. All eyes turned to me, the man who had upended the order Karen had maintained for years. I placed the binder on the podium, beside her messy stack of papers. Calmly, without raising my voice, I opened it and spread the documents out for all to see. One by one, I displayed the deeds, the surveys, the contracts signed by the developers. The same documents I had revealed weeks before, but this time, I explained them with deliberate clarity. I pointed out the dates, the signatures, the county stamps. I showed them that the valley had been purchased by my grandfather long before Karen or her HOA ever set foot here. The truth was undeniable. Karen tried to interrupt, her voice shrill and cracking as she shouted over me. But each interruption only made her look more frantic, more unstable. The neighbors leaned forward, studying the papers, their doubts melting into certainty. Finally, I lifted the most damning document of all, the lease agreements signed by the developers, acknowledging that the homes built in the valley sat on land owned by my family. Every acre, I said quietly, but firmly, belongs to me. Not to the HOA, not to Karen, to my family, and now, to me. The silence that followed was heavy. Karen's face blanched, then flushed crimson. She sputtered, searching for words, but none came. Her stack of papers, filled with irrelevant bylaws and self-written rules, looked flimsy and absurd beside the weight of official deeds. The neighbors began to murmur, louder this time, voices rising in waves. Some shook their heads in disbelief. Others laughed bitterly, realizing how long they had been manipulated. A few even stood, pointing at Karen, demanding explanations. Her empire collapsed in that moment. Karen's mask shattered. Her polished smile twisted into a grimace, her voice breaking into shrieks as she accused me of trickery, accused the neighbors of betrayal, accused the entire valley of conspiring against her. Her words tumbled out in a frenzy, wild and incoherent. But no one listened anymore. Neighbors rose from their seats, gathering around me instead of her. They asked questions, not of Karen, but of me. They wanted reassurance, clarity, truth. And for the first time, the valley looked not to her for guidance, but to me. Karen's shouts grew more desperate as the crowd turned away. Finally, she slammed her fist against the podium, sending her flimsy papers scattering across the ground. With a final, strangled cry of outrage, she stormed out of the pavilion, her heels clattering against the concrete, her banners fluttering uselessly in the breeze. No one followed her. That was the end of Karen's reign. In the days that followed, the valley shifted in ways small but profound. The neighbors stopped looking over their shoulders in fear of fines. They stopped receiving angry letters and petty citations. Children played more freely in the streets. Lawns grew naturally without rigid conformity. And for the first time in years, laughter replaced whispers. As for Karen, she retreated into her house at the end of the cul-de-sac. The clipboard vanished. The driveway gatherings ended. Curtains stayed drawn, and though rumors swirled about her plans to move away, no one really knew. The queen bee had lost her hive, and without her followers, she was simply alone. I spent more time on the porch of the cabin, watching the valley with a quiet sense of peace. The war was over. The documents were safe, the truth was known, and the neighbors no longer saw me as an outsider, but as the rightful steward of the valley. It wasn't about power. It wasn't about control. It was about legacy. My grandfather had built this cabin, my family had preserved this land, and now I had reclaimed it from the grip of a woman who mistook fear for leadership. The valley was mine again. Not just in name, not just on paper, but in spirit. And though Karen had lost, the valley had won.